The temperature at the Greystone airstrip was 32 below zero. When the oil pressure gauge on the starboard engine of our Twin Otter began to drop. I'm an aviation mechanic, not a pilot, but I've spent enough years in the back of utility planes to know the sound of a compressor struggling against freezing air. It's a dry, hollow, metallic rattle that makes your teeth ache. By the time our pilot, Hank, skidded the plane onto the packed gravel runway of the remote outpost, the wind shear coming off the Brooks Range was already whistling through the door seals. Greystone wasn't a town. It was a fueling depot, 3 galvanized steel hangars, and a handful of modular cabins operated by the Regional Wilderness Service. Population 4, and that was only during the summer transit season. In November, it was just a frozen strip of gravel surrounded by miles of black spruce and granite peaks. I hopped down from the cargo bay, my boots crunching on the dry, frozen dirt. The wind hit me like a sheet of corrugated iron, driving ice crystals straight through the seams of my heavy canvas parka. I reached back into the fuselage to help our only passenger down. Clara Thomas didn't take my hand. She didn't refuse it, out of spite either. Her hands were simply too full. She was clutching a heavy, double-walled thermal transport case to her chest like a shield. She was a logistics specialist for the Arctic Health Initiative, tasked with delivering 3 cases of cold-chain pediatric vaccines to a remote clinic 300 miles farther north. If those cases dropped below 2 degrees Celsius, the proteins would denature, and $10,000 of medical supplies would become nothing more than expensive, cloudy water. "How long?" she asked, her voice muffled by a thick wool neck gaiter. "The wind is sustained at 45 knots with gusts over 60, I said, leaning closer so she could hear me over the roar of the prop engine shutting down. "The temperature is dropping a degree every 10 minutes. Hank can't fly in this, and I can't open the engine cowling to check the oil lines without the wind ripping the panels off. We're grounded, Clara." She didn't argue. She didn't sigh or look at the sky in frustration. She simply adjusted her grip on the thermal case, checked the blinking digital display on the lid, which read 4 degrees, and looked toward the low-slung, cedar-paneled cabins 50 yards away. "Then we need to find power," she said. "These cases have an 8-hour internal battery life. If we don't plug them into a stable grid by nightfall, the heaters inside will fail." The airport manager, an old-timer named Miller, who looked like he had been cured in wood smoke and salt, met us at the door of the main office. He had bad news before we even took our gloves off. "Heated cabin number 3 had a pipe burst yesterday," Miller said, pouring black coffee into a couple of dented tin cups. "Water got into the subfloor wiring. It's dead." The only heated space with a working generator connection right now is the sleeper cabin behind the radio shack, and it's only got 1 bunk. I looked at Clara. Her face was pale from the cold, but her jaw was set. She didn't look like someone who spent her life behind a desk in Anchorage. She looked like someone who had calculated the exact thermal efficiency of her survival gear before she boarded the plane. "The cargo comes inside," she said. "Everything else is secondary. There's a small cot in the corner of the sleeper cabin," Miller added, looking between the two of us. "And a wood stove that'll keep the place around 60 degrees if you don't mind feeding it every 3 hours. But you two are going to be close." "We'll manage," Clara said. She looked at me, her gray eyes cool and analytical. "I'll split the only available cabin with you, Ben, but only if you promise not to make me regret it by trying to be chivalrous and sleeping in the hangar. I don't need a hero. I need a mechanic who can help me keep these cases at 3.4 degrees. "I don't have enough layers to sleep in the hangar anyway," I replied. "And I don't particularly like the idea of freezing to death for the sake of polite manners. Let's get the cases." The walk to the sleeper cabin was a lesson in Alaskan scale. The wind howled off the flats, turning the 50 yards of gravel path into a blind white corridor of blowing snow. I carried 2 of the 40-pound thermal cases, while Clara carried the 3rd and her personal gear bag. Every step was a deliberate effort to keep from slipping on the black ice beneath the drifts. The cabin was small, maybe 12 by 12. It smelled of dry spruce, kerosene, and the cold metallic scent of iron that has been frozen and thawed too many times. A small wood stove sat in the corner, its pipe venting straight through the roof. A single wooden bunk. Bed frame fitted with a thin institutional mattress was built into the far wall. Next to it was a narrow folding table and a single wooden chair. I set the cases down on the table, my fingers stiff. Even inside my insulated gloves, Clara immediately went to work, pulling a heavy-duty power strip and 3 adapter cables from her pack. "We need the generator," she said, her fingers moving with rapid, practiced efficiency. I knelt by the wall outlet, checked the voltage indicator with a pocket tester, and shook my head. The main generator is fluctuating. Miller's running it on an old belt that's slipping in the cold. It's dropping below 80 volts every few minutes. That's going to fry your battery chargers. Clara's pencil stopped over her logbook. She looked at the blinking red warning light on the lead case. If we don't charge them now, the internal heaters will start drawing down the reserve. How long can you give me on a stable line? "Give me 20 minutes, I said. "I've got a portable 2-stroke generator in the cargo hold of the Twin Otter. It's small, but the voltage regulator is solid. I'll rig a line through the window." "Go," she said. "I'll start the wood stove." I went back out into the wind. The cold had turned from a physical sensation into a dull, heavy ache in my chest. In the cargo bay of the plane, I found the small Honda generator. It was frozen solid, the pull start cord stiff and unyielding. I had to carry it into the main hangar, use a propane torch to gently heat the crankcase until the oil thinned enough to turn, and then haul it back to the cabin. By the time I slid the window of the cabin open and passed the heavy orange extension cord through, my eyelashes were iced together. Clara was there to take the line. The cabin was already warming up, the small wood stove crackling with dry, split birch. The smell of wood smoke was incredibly sweet after the sharp, clean bite of the sub-zero air. I climbed inside, sealed the window with an old towel to keep the draft out, and knelt by the cases. Clara plugged the adapters into the orange cord. One by one, the red lights on the thermal boxes turned to a solid, reassuring green. Clara let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since we landed. She pulled off her heavy, fur-lined cap, letting her dark hair fall around her shoulders. Her face was flushed from the heat of the stove, but her eyes remained focused on the digital displays. 3-4 degrees, she murmured. "Stable, for now," I said, peeling off my outer shell jacket and hanging it on a nail near the stove. "That 2-stroke generator only holds half a gallon of fuel. At this temperature, it'll run for about 4 hours before it needs a top-off. That means one of us is going out there at midnight, and again at 4 in the morning." Clara looked at the narrow bunk bed, then at the small space of floor between the table and the stove. "We'll rotate. I take the midnight run, you take the 4 a.m. "I'll take the midnight," I said. "You don't know the choke setting on that unit. It's temperamental in the cold. If you flood it, we're done." "Then show me how to do it," she replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I'm a logistics manager, Ben. I don't rely on single points of failure, and right now, your knowledge of that engine is a single point of failure. If you slip on the ice and break your wrist, I need to know how to start that motor." I looked at her for a long moment. There was no vanity in her voice, only the flat, logical reality of survival in a place that didn't care about our convenience. "All right," I said. "I'll show you, but let's get some water on the stove first." We spent the next hour establishing our boundaries in the tiny cabin. It was an unspoken contract, built on mutual respect and the recognition of our limited space. I took the left side of the room near the toolboxes in the window. She took the right, near her specimen cases, and the bunk. There was no flirting, no awkward jokes, and no false modesty. When Clara needed to change out of her damp base layers, she simply hung her spare wool blanket across the corner of the room as a temporary screen. I kept my eyes on my portable multimeter, adjusting the resistance screws with a precision that was entirely unnecessary, but kept my focus where it belonged. "You're very quiet," she said from behind the blanket, her voice slightly muffled by the wool. "In my line of work, if you're making noise, it usually means something is breaking," I said, not looking up. "I've learned that silence is generally a sign that things are running the way they're supposed to." "That must make for lonely field seasons," she remarked. "Sometimes," I said, "but it's predictable. The machines don't change their mind halfway through a job. If they fail, it's usually because someone didn't pay attention to the maintenance schedule. It's never personal." The blanket rustled, and she stepped out wearing a dry gray fleece and thermal leggings. She sat on the edge of the bunk, her boots off, her feet tucked under her to stay warm. "I can understand that," she said, looking at the 3 glowing green lights on her cases. "My work is all about predictability, too. Or at least, it's supposed to be. But when you're dealing with human systems, everything is personal." "What do you mean?" I asked, setting down the meter. "My department head, Dr. Vance, didn't want this shipment sent by small aircraft," she said, her voice tightening slightly. "He wanted to wait for the spring road convoy. But the clinic in Fort Yukon has been out of basic pediatric supplies since September. If we waited until March, we'd be treating preventable outbreaks with nothing but hope." He told me that if I insisted on the air charter and anything went wrong, if the cold chain broke for even an hour, he would log it as a safety violation and suspend my field clearance. "So, he's looking for an excuse to pull your budget," I said. "He's looking for a clean report that says his plan was the only safe one," she corrected. "He doesn't care about the clinic. He cares about the liability form. If I lose these samples, he gets to say, 'I told you so,' from his heated office in Anchorage, and I get reassigned to a desk where I can't make any more noise. And your career?" "I've spent 6 years building this distribution network," she said, looking out the frost-covered window. "If I go back to database entry, the program dies and the remote clinics go back to the bottom of the state priority list. So, no, I can't let these cases fail. I won't." The wind hit the side of the cabin then, a sudden violent gust that made the cedar logs groan. The small hanging lantern swung from the center beam, casting long sliding shadows across the floor. Through the wall, we could hear the muffled, high-pitched whine of the 2-stroke engine outside, struggling to maintain its RPM against the pressure drop. "The wind is shifting," I said, standing up and pulling my boots back on. "It's coming straight out of the north now. That means the intake on the generator is going to start packing with drift snow." "I'm coming with you," Clara said, reaching for her parka. "No need. It's just a clear out." We agreed, Ben. "I need to see the setup before it gets dark. If the intake packs while you're asleep, I need to know what to look for." I didn't argue. Her logic was too clean. We stepped out into the storm together. The cold was different now. It was dry and sharp, the kind of air that makes your lungs feel small. Our headlamps cut through the blowing white screen, illuminating the small Honda generator tucked into the lee of the cabin wall. As I had feared, the fine, sugar-like snow was drifting around the air filter housing. I knelt in the snow, using my gloved hand to clear the intake path. "See this?" I shouted over the wind, pointing my light at the black plastic grill. "If this gets iced over, the fuel mixture goes too rich. The engine will choke itself out within 10 minutes. You have to keep this clear, and you have to make sure the exhaust port doesn't blow back into the intake." Clara leaned in close, her hood touching mine. Her breath came in short white puffs that froze instantly on her collar. She watched my fingers work, nodding once. "The choke lever," she said, pointing to the small gray tab on the side. "If it starts to sputter..." "Do I back it off?" "Only if the engine is warm," I told her. "If it's cold, Keep it at half choke until the block heats up. Here, put your hand on it. Feel the vibration. That's what a healthy cylinder feels like. If it starts to jump or skip, the fuel line is freezing. She reached out, her thick glove pressing against the housing. Our shoulders brushed against each other as we leaned over the machine in the dark. Two people huddled over 5 horsepower of iron that was currently the only thing keeping her life's work alive. "I've got it," she said. "Let's get back inside before our skin sticks to the metal." We scrambled back through the door, stamping our boots on the entry mat. The cabin felt incredibly warm now, almost hot, though the thermometer on the wall only read 58. I threw another log of birch into the stove, the wood catching with a bright, cheerful hiss. Clara sat on the edge of the bunk, her hands wrapped around her tin mug of hot water. "That's a temperamental little beast," she said, a small dry smile appearing at the corner of her mouth. "Most useful things are," I said, setting my tools back in the box. "If it were easy to run, they wouldn't need us out here." "Is that why you chose this work?" she asked. "Because you like being needed by things that are hard to run." "I chose it because I like things that can be fixed," I said, sitting on the wooden chair across from her. "If an engine fails, there's always a reason. A worn seal, a blocked jet, a cracked wire. You find the cause, you replace the part, and it works again. People aren't like that. You can do everything right with a person, follow every rule on the schematic, and they'll still break down for reasons they don't even understand themselves." She looked at me, her expression quiet and thoughtful. "That's a very lonely way to look at the world, Ben." "Maybe," I said, "but it's functional. I've never had a carburetor lie to me about why it stopped working." "No," she agreed softly, her fingers tracing the edge of her mug. "But a carburetor won't help you clear the snow off your roof either." We fell into a quiet, comfortable silence after that. It wasn't the awkward silence of two strangers forced into a small space, but the functional quiet of a team that had established its rhythm. At midnight, the alarm on my watch went off. I stood up, reached for my coat, but Clara was already on her feet. "My turn," she said, her voice steady. "Clara, the wind is up to 50 knots, I said, looking at the window where the ice had formed thick, feathery patterns. "I should go." "We had an agreement, Ben," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. "If you don't let me do my share, this isn't a partnership, it's a rescue. And I told you, I don't need to be rescued." I looked at her for a long second, seeing the absolute determination in her set jaw. "All right," I said. "Take the flashlight with the orange lanyard. If you aren't back in 5 minutes, I'm coming out after you." 4 minutes, she said. "I've timed the fuel fill. It takes exactly 90 seconds. She stepped out into the black, roaring night. I stood by the door, my hand on the latch, my ears tuned to the thin, distant hum of the generator. I counted the seconds in my head. 60, 80, 90. The engine didn't sputter. The pitch didn't change. At 110 seconds, the door flew open, and Clara tumbled back inside, covered in white drift. She slammed the door behind her, her chest heaving, her face bright red from the wind. She was laughing, a short, breathless sound that seemed to surprise her as much as it did me. "It's cold out there," she gasped, stripping off her wet gloves. "But the intake was clear, and the tank is full." "You did it," I said, a small grin breaking through my own quiet exterior. "No flooding?" "I set the choke exactly where you told me," she said, her eyes shining in the lantern light. "The little beast didn't even skip a beat." She hung her coat up, her movements quick and energized by the cold air. For the first time since we had met on the tarmac in Anchorage, she looked relaxed. The heavy protective armor she wore against her department, against her career fears, seemed to have been left out in the snowdrift. "You're not a bad mechanic, Clara," I said, pouring her a fresh cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. "And you're not a bad teacher, Ben," she replied, taking the mug. Our fingers brushed against each other, cold skin against warm hand. For a fraction of a second, neither of us pulled back. The warmth of the room seemed to concentrate in that small space between us, quiet and unexpected. We slept in shifts after that. I took the floor on a spare sleeping pad, my back against my toolbox, while Clara took the thin mattress of the bunk. Despite the hard ground and the constant low-frequency hum of the generator outside, I slept better than I had in months. By morning of day 2, the clearing looked like a different world. The drifts had piled up to the window sills of the cabin, sealing us into a quiet white cocoon. The twin otter on the runway was barely visible through the blowing screen, its wings covered in a thick layer of rime ice. We spent the day managing the systems. We checked the generator every 3 hours, cleared the intake, and monitored the thermal cases. The temperature inside the boxes remained rock solid at 3-4 degrees. But our isolation was broken around noon when the satellite phone in Clara's pack began to beep. The signal was weak, static-filled, but the caller ID was clear. Dr. Vance. Clara answered, her voice immediately shifting back into the professional guarded tone I had first heard in Anchorage. "Vance, this is Clara. We're grounded at Gray Stone. The weather is below minimums." The speaker on the phone was loud enough that I could hear his voice through the static, thin, sharp, and impatient. "Clara, I've checked the regional reports. The wind in Fort Yukon is clear. You've missed your delivery window by 12 hours. This is exactly the kind of logistical instability I warned you about." "The wind here is 60 knots, Vance," Clara said, her grip on the phone tightening until her knuckles were white. "We have a severe low-pressure system sitting right over the range. It is physically impossible to fly. The charter company says the plane is rated for 40-knot crosswinds." Vance's voice cut back. "If your pilot is refusing to fly, it's a crew compliance issue. I am logging this as a failure to deliver under contract. If those vaccines are spoiled because you decided to sit out a storm in a comfortable cabin, the responsibility is entirely yours." Clara opened her mouth to reply, her face pale, but the line went dead. The satellite signal had cut out in the storm. She stood there holding the silent phone, her shoulders trembling slightly under her fleece. The green lights on the cases beside her seemed to mock her with their quiet, steady glow. "He's going to use this," she whispered. "He's going to say we abandoned the run because we were afraid of the weather." I stood up from my tool chest. I walked over to the table, picked up my official aviation mechanics logbook, the heavy, leather-bound volume where every maintenance, action, and flight delay must be recorded under federal regulations, and laid it down beside her cases. "He can say whatever he wants to his board," I said quietly, "but he can't argue with an FAA-registered logbook." I have already entered the weather conditions, the wind shear alerts from the regional dispatch, and my official maintenance assessment of the Twin Otter's starboard engine block. Under federal law, a pilot or mechanic who authorizes a flight under these conditions is subject to immediate license revocation and criminal liability. I wrote that down, Clara, and I signed my name to it. "Wes?" She looked at the book, then up at me. "You did?" "I did," I said, and I added a note that Dr. Sender. Thomas took immediate successful action to preserve the cold chain integrity of her cargo by securing a secondary power source under survival conditions. If Vance tries to file a safety violation against you, he has to file it against me, too. And my union has a very large, very expensive team of lawyers who love nothing more than showing desk-bound administrators exactly what happens when they try to bypass federal safety protocols. Clara stared at me, her eyes wide, before a soft, genuine laugh broke through her tension. It was the first time I had seen her truly smile. Not the dry, calculated smile of a survivor, but a warm, brilliant expression that made the small cabin feel twice as bright. "You really don't like people who try to bypass the maintenance schedule, do you?" she said, her voice soft and full of something that felt very much like admiration. "I like things that run according to the rules," I said, looking down at the logbook. "And the rule is, you protect your crew, and you protect your cargo." "Thank you, Ben," she said, her voice dropping to a quiet, steady tone that went straight through my professional guard. "Team effort," I said, using her own phrase. "Team effort," she agreed. The storm began to break late on day 3. The wind dropped from a roar to a low, distant whistle, and the gray, bruised sky over the Brooks Range began to split, revealing thin, clean lines of pale blue. I spent the morning clearing the ice off the Twin Otter's engines, my hands cold, but my mind remarkably clear. Clara worked beside me, using a plastic scraper to clear the cockpit glass, while Hank, our pilot, checked the fuel sumps. By noon, the starboard engine caught with a loud, smoky roar, the prop turning smoothly against the crisp winter air. We loaded the thermal cases back into the fuselage. As we prepared to climb into the cabin, Miller, the station manager, walked out to the runway to wave us off. "You two made a good team out there," he said, looking between us with a knowing squint. "Most folks would have spent 3 days in that cabin trying to tear each other's hair out. You two didn't even make a dent in the woodwork." "We had a good system," Clara said, stepping up onto the cargo ladder. She looked back at me, her dark hair catching the first real sunlight we had seen in 72 hours, and a very good mechanic. The flight to Fort Yukon was quiet, the mountains below us sparkling under a hard, brilliant blue sky. When we landed, the clinic staff was waiting on the tarmac with a heated van. The transfer of the cases took less than 10 minutes. Every display was still reading exactly 34 degrees. As the clinic director signed the delivery log, she looked at Clara with a mix of relief and surprise. "We heard the storm was brutal up at Greystone. We didn't think you'd make the window." "We had a few logistical challenges," Clara said, her eyes shifting to where I stood by the plane's tail assembly. "But we had the right tools for the job." That evening, we stood in the small lobby of the Fort Yukon Transit Station, waiting for our return flights to Anchorage. The regular regional transport was scheduled for the next morning. Clara held her logistics folder against her chest, her fingers tapping gently against the leather cover. The quiet between us was different now. It was no longer the silence of survival, but the heavy, expectant pause of two people who were about to go back to their separate, predictable worlds. "Dr. Ide?" "Thance called," she said, looking toward the window where the first streetlights of the small town were flickering on. The clinic director sent him the receipt log. He didn't have much to say, especially after I emailed him a scan of your logbook entry. "Good," I said. "He shouldn't. The data was clear." "Yes," she agreed. The data was perfect. She turned back to me, her gray eyes warm and steady. "I have to file my final report in Anchorage on Friday. It's going to be a very long, very dry meeting." "I'm sure you'll manage," I said. "You're very good at logistics." "I am," she said. "But I was thinking, the department has a budget for safety consultants. We need someone who can review our remote field operations, someone who knows how to keep things running when the system fails." I looked at her, my hand resting on my tool bag. "Is that a formal offer, Clara?" "It's a practical calculation," she said, her lips curving into that small, brilliant smile. 1, intact shelter. 2, sets of data, and a team that doesn't break under pressure. It would be highly inefficient to let that kind of compatibility go to waste. I looked at the window, then at the woman who had spent 48 hours in a freezing cabin with me without once asking to be saved. "I don't like inefficient systems," I said quietly. "Neither do I," she said. "So dinner. On Friday?" "After I finish with Vance," No survival rations, no two-stroke engines, and absolutely no freeze-dried potatoes. That sounds like a very strict protocol, I said, my voice softening as I took a step closer to her. You respect protocols, Ben, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. I do, I said. I'll follow this one. She smiled, and for the first time in years, the silence around my work didn't feel like an empty space. It felt like the quiet before a new engine catches, smooth and steady, ready for the long road ahead.